The day my mother's estate attorney opened that second envelope, my brother-in-law actually laughed out loud. Not a nervous laugh, a real one. The kind that fills a room and makes everyone else look at the floor. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, that my mother had known exactly what she was doing all along. But I should back up. My mother, Irene, spent the last 31 years of her life painting. Not as a hobby, not as something she did on Sunday afternoons to pass the time. It was the thing she did the way other people breathe. She painted in the mornings before anyone else woke up. She painted on holidays. She painted the week after my father's funeral, sitting in the garage with the door cracked open, and a cup of coffee going cold on the workbench beside her. When my sister and I were teenagers, we used to complain that she loved her canvases more than she loved us. Looking back, I think we were wrong. I think she was just trying to make sense of the world the only way she knew how. And the paintings were the record of that. She never sold anything. That was the thing people always found strange. Friends would come over, see the work stacked against every wall in her studio, and ask why she didn't list them somewhere. Put them in a local gallery. At least try. My mother would just shake her head and say she wasn't ready. For 31 years, she was never ready. My sister Audrey never understood that. Audrey was 12 years older than me. Sharp and practical in the way that comes from spending 2 decades in corporate finance. She had a beautiful house 40 minutes outside Charlotte, a husband named Russell who wore the same expression in every photo. Confident, slightly impatient, and 2 kids who were already talking about prep school. Audrey had built exactly the life she'd planned for, and she was proud of it. There was nothing wrong with that. The friction between Audrey and our mother was old and layered. It went back to before I was born, from what I could piece together. Something about choices our mother made when she was young. A marriage my grandmother disapproved of. Years of distance that never fully closed. By the time I was old enough to notice, the 2 of them had settled into a polite, careful rhythm. Phone calls on birthdays. Thanksgiving every other year. Compliments that landed a half-second too late to feel real. When our mother was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 3 years ago, Audrey called immediately. She was helpful in the organized logistical way she was good at. She researched specialists, sent links, offered to set up a care calendar. But she lived 40 minutes away and worked long hours and had a full life, and so the day-to-day reality of things fell to me. I lived 12 minutes from my mother's house. I was a middle school art teacher, which meant my schedule had more flexibility than most. And honestly, even if it hadn't, I would have found a way. She was my mother. For nearly 3 years, I drove her to neurology appointments at Atrium Health every 6 weeks. I sat with her in waiting rooms that smelled like recycled air and bad coffee, filling out the same intake forms over and over because the clipboards were different, even when the questions weren't. I organized her medications into a weekly pill case every Sunday evening. The blue one for mornings, the white one for evenings, the small orange one that she always forgot and I always reminded her about. I learned to cook the things she could still eat comfortably when swallowing became harder. I hired her cleaning service after she could no longer manage it herself, and I covered the cost for 8 months before she finally let me add it to her household expenses. When she could no longer drive safely, I became her transportation. Groceries runs on Saturdays, the pharmacy on Tuesdays, the occasional trip to the botanical garden, which she loved, because even when her hands shook, she still noticed the way light moved through leaves, still pointed things out to me the way she always had. I also became the person who sat with her in the evenings and just listened. Not because anyone asked me to, because she was my mother, and she was still in there, fully present and sharp and funny and sometimes heartbreaking, and I didn't want to miss any of it. Audrey visited when she could. That's the honest version. She would come on a Saturday every month or 2. Bring flowers, take my mother to lunch somewhere nice. She was generous with gifts, a cashmere cardigan for Christmas, a beautiful leather journal that my mother never opened. She flew in for the harder medical appointments when I told her it was really important. She was not absent. but she was not there the way I was there, and everyone, including Audrey, knew it. What nobody knew, not me, not Audrey, not anyone, was what our mother had been quietly doing for the 2 years before she died. She passed in March, on a Tuesday morning, which felt exactly like her. Unremarkable on the outside. Everything on the inside. The hospice nurse called me at 6:42. I arrived before anyone else. The weeks after were the kind of weeks you don't remember clearly. You move through them on autopilot. Phone calls, paperwork, a funeral that goes by in a blur of casseroles and condolence cards, and people saying she was so talented. Why didn't she ever sell her work? I thanked everyone. I drove home each evening to my small apartment and sat with the feeling of the world being different in a way I couldn't name yet. 6 weeks after the funeral, Audrey and I sat in the office of my mother's estate attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Holt, who had a wooden duck on his desk and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and the kind of careful manner that made you feel like whatever came next would at least be handled professionally. Russell had come with Audrey. He hadn't been specifically invited, but Audrey had mentioned she wanted him there, and no one objected. He sat slightly behind her with his arms crossed, the way he always sat in rooms where he was assessing whether the situation was worth his time. Mr. Holt opened the primary folder. The house went to both of us equally, to be sold and divided, or one of us could buy out the other's share. The savings account, modest but meaningful, split evenly. Personal items to be distributed by mutual agreement. Standard language. Nothing surprising. Then Mr. Holt said, "Your mother also left a letter, which she asked me to read aloud before I addressed the second part of her estate." I looked at Audrey. She looked at me. Russell uncrossed and recrossed his arms. Mr. Holt unfolded 3 pages of my mother's stationery. The pale blue kind she'd used for everything since I could remember. Her handwriting was there, slightly uneven from the tremor, but unmistakably hers. He cleared his throat and began. "To my daughters. I know that one of you expected this letter, and one of you didn't. I'll let you figure out which is which." Even through the grief, I almost smiled. I want to say something first that I should have said more often while I was alive. I know what these last 3 years looked like from the outside. I know what they cost. Not just the Saturday mornings and the medication schedules and the drives to the garden when I just needed to see something beautiful. I know it cost you sleep and worry and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who is slowly leaving. I saw it. I never said it enough, but I saw every single bit of it. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the table. I also want to be clear that I'm not writing this letter to punish anyone or to make anyone feel accused of something. I made my choices. Everyone made theirs. But a mother watches, even when she pretends not to. Russell shifted in his chair. Audrey's expression didn't change. "There is a second matter that Mr. Holt will explain after this letter. I ask that you listen to all of it before anyone says anything." That was always the problem in our family. We spoke before we finished hearing. I'd like us to do better, at least once, even if I'm not there to see it. I love you both. I always have. But love is not always the same thing as fairness, and I made peace with that a long time ago. I hope you will too. Mr. Holt refolded the letter. The room was very quiet. Then he reached into his briefcase and removed a second, thicker folder. "Approximately 22 months ago," he said, "your mother was contacted by a representative from the Alderton Gallery in New York." Audrey frowned slightly. "The gallery in Chelsea?" "Yes." Mr. Holt set several documents on the table. A curator there had seen photographs of your mother's work, apparently shared online by a former student of hers, and reached out expressing significant interest. Over the following months, your mother entered into a formal agreement with the gallery. I didn't understand what I was hearing yet. I genuinely didn't. "The agreement," Mr. Holt continued, "covers the exclusive representation and exhibition rights for your mother's complete body of work, 147 paintings completed over 31 years. Russell leaned forward for the first time. "The Alderton mounted a private exhibition in January," Mr. Holt said. "It was not publicized widely. It was specifically designed to attract serious collectors before a public showing later this year. He paused. 11 works sold during that showing, at prices ranging from $18,000 to $64,000. The remaining works are under a standing exhibition agreement with royalty terms that project continued revenue for the next several years. The number, he said, next is one I won't repeat here, not because it's a secret, but because numbers have a way of making people focus on the wrong thing. What I will say is that it was more than the house. Significantly more. And that was before the public exhibition scheduled for autumn. Audrey made a sound I'd never heard from her before. Russell said, "How is that possible?" She never, and then stopped. "Your mother was very private about this," Mr. Holt said. "She worked with the gallery's representative by phone and by mail. She used a P.O. box she opened 2 years ago. She did not tell either of you." He looked at both of us over his glasses. "She was very specific about that in our conversations. She wanted the work to be evaluated on its own terms, without family opinion becoming part of the process." Audrey turned to me. There was something in her face I didn't know how to read. "Did you know about this?" "No," I said, "and it was completely true. You were over there every week." "I was there for her, not to inventory her studio." She looked back at Mr. Holt. "So the gallery income, designated entirely to your sister," he said. "Per your mother's written instructions, the proceeds from the gallery agreement, both the sales to date and future royalties under the exhibition contract, are to pass entirely to her youngest daughter." He looked at me. "To you." The room didn't explode. It went very still. Russell stood up. He didn't say anything inflammatory, to his credit, but the way he stood said everything. The quick movement, the jaw tight, the scan of the room like he was looking for someone to argue with. Audrey said, "That doesn't seem..." And then she stopped herself too. I watched her do it. I watched her pull back from whatever she'd been about to say, and I respected her for it in that moment. Mr. Holt let the silence sit for a moment before he continued. "There's one additional detail your mother asked me to share." He turned to another page. "The property, the studio space your mother built on the back of the house, was constructed under a separate permit from the main residence. Legally, it is a detached structure with its own assessed value. Your mother's instructions specify that the studio itself, along with its contents and all works remaining there, is to remain intact and pass to her youngest daughter as well." He looked up. "This means that for the purposes of the property division, the studio structure and its contents are not part of the shared estate. The main house square footage is what will be appraised and divided." Russell found his voice. "You're saying the most valuable part of the property was never jointly owned to begin with," Mr. Holt said, in a tone that was entirely pleasant and entirely final. "Your mother was quite deliberate in how she structured this." There was a long pause. Then Audrey said, quietly, "She planned this for approximately 2 years, yes," Mr. Holt said. "She was very organized. I thought about my mother sitting at her kitchen table with her blue stationery, her hands shaking slightly, writing words she knew I wouldn't hear until she was gone. I thought about her on the phone with a gallery curator, speaking carefully, choosing which paintings to photograph. Doing all of it without saying a word. Smiling at me over coffee on Saturday mornings like there was nothing going on at all. She had never once let on." Audrey and Russell left before I did. They weren't rude about it. There was no dramatic exit, no slammed doors. Audrey paused at the door and turned back and looked at me for a moment. "I don't know exactly what she was feeling. I know what I hope she was feeling," she said. "I'll call you." And I said okay. And she left. I sat in that office for a while longer after they were gone. Mr. Holt was patient. He didn't rush me. I kept thinking about a Saturday last October, maybe 5 weeks before my mother went into hospice. It had been a good day, which meant she was alert and not in too much pain. And the light was coming through the kitchen window. The way she always said was the only reason she'd ever agreed to buy that house. We had been sitting at the kitchen table with our coffee going cold the way it always did, and she had said, out of nowhere, "You know the thing I'm most proud of?" I assumed she meant a painting. She was always making me guess which one was her current favorite. But she had looked at me and said, "You. Just you." And then she'd changed the subject, and we'd talked about something else. And I hadn't thought much of it at the time because she said things like that occasionally, and I never quite knew how to hold them. I thought about it a lot now. I don't tell this story to make Audrey into a villain. She isn't one. She made the choices she made and lived the life she built. And none of that is evil. It's just different from the choices I made. Our mother saw all of it, from her studio window and her kitchen table and the passenger seat of my car on all those drives, and she made her own choices in return. She did it quietly, the way she did everything, and she trusted that eventually the whole picture would become clear. She was right. At the end of that Tuesday morning in Mr. Holt's office, with his wooden duck and his careful manner and my mother's pale blue stationery folded back into its envelope, everything was exactly as clear as she'd intended. I drove to the botanical garden on the way home. I don't know why, exactly. It just seemed like the right place to go. I sat on the bench we used to sit on together. The one near the Japanese maple that she always said looked like it was on fire in the fall. And I watched the light move through the leaves the way she'd taught me to see it. She had been watching all along, and when the moment came, she had said everything she needed to say. I stayed there until the light changed.